Hello. So welcome back, everybody, from the break. Thanks everyone who's still around and holding on. We have an excellent panel discussion coming up, led by Dr. Sydney Kennedy. So without further ado, you can go ahead, Sid. Actually, just also wanted to say thank you for those who filled in the poll as well. If we can share the results. Let's see. How likely are you to choose psychedelic assisted psychotherapy if you were struggling with severe mental health problems?
And the answer is more than 50%.
Indeed.
That's a very interesting distribution. And if this was marketing a new product, we would have done a good job. So it is a long haul, and we're not done yet, but I really do appreciate the panelists so far and our two excellent chairs. A pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Verbora, who's the medical director of Field Trip Health. He's also an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at McMaster University in Hamilton, and he's a student health physician at Seneca College. So pleasure to have you present today, Michael.
Thank you for having me. Oh, sorry, let's get this to the beginning. Bear with me. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Looking forward to this final panel. And my talk today will be a little bit about working within existing legalizations, and specifically as a clinician who is helping patients with ketamine, I'd like to really share some of the experiences and data that we have at Field Trip Health. First, I'd like to give some disclosures. So I am the medical director at Field Trip Health, which is a publicly traded psychedelic company. I'm also the chief medical officer of Aleafia Health, a publicly traded medical cannabis company. And I do serve as faculty at McMaster University. So the agenda for today will be going over the scheduling of psychedelics in Canada, what an exemption process looks like today, something called the Special Access Program, which I'd love to share with you, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy today in the context of legalized medicines, and then share with you some clinical outcome data that's unpublished. So there's a policy in Canada, or a law known as the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Many different countries around the world have ways to regulate drugs. In Canada, we have a scheduling system, which goes from 1, 2, 3, as well as unscheduled. And it's perceived that Schedule 1 drugs have the highest risk, and Schedule 3 or unscheduled drugs would have the least amount of risk. And legally, these have penalties if you are caught with possession or distribution of them, if not obtained legally. How a drug is scheduled does not necessarily mean it's legal or illegal. Typically, the higher scheduled drugs are the harder drugs to research. And what's interesting is if you look at the schedule here in Canada, Schedule 1 drugs include opiate pharmaceuticals, cocoa leaves and cocaine, as well as ketamine, amphetamines and MDMA. Schedule 2 are synthetic cannabinoids. Schedule 3 would be psilocybin, psilocin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline. So theoretically, again, Schedule 1 drugs have the most amount of risk, and Schedule 2 and 3 would have the least amount of risk or lower risk. Despite all this, ketamine is really the only legal psychedelic. And I know some people will argue that ketamine is or is not a psychedelic. And that's a whole other day for another debate. But the others remain illegal for manufacturing, possession, and consumption. So other than ketamine, drugs like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, here in Canada are technically illegal. There might be some nuances or special exceptions to that, but in general, I would say that they're illegal. And if you look at the US, they use a similar scheduling system. And if you look at the vast majority of the psychedelic drugs there as well, they also are scheduled, and some of them are scheduled differently. So in the US, ketamine is a Schedule 3 drug. In Canada, it's a Schedule 1 drug. So same data that people analyze, just different perceptions or views of it. Now in Canada, we have something called the Section 56 exemption, and I think some people might have touched on it. And so within the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, there's this opportunity for the Minister of Health to review the special circumstances of a Canadian who may have extenuating circumstances that may require psychedelics, and they can, on a one-on-one basis, provide an exemption to allow them to possess and use psychedelic substances. And here in Canada, we've been successful in having a number of patients achieve that. And so to date, there's a dozen or two, not just patients, but even practitioners who are working with psychedelic drugs who've been granted access to psilocybin. Now, there's a lot of problems with the Section 56 exemption, and I've highlighted them here. So first of all, it requires the ministry review in each of these cases. It can take months to get a response. And as you can imagine, people with terminal cancer don't want to wait months to get an answer whether they could use this for end-of-life anxiety. The ministry is not really set up to deal with a mass flood or potential number of applications. It's very expensive often for patients to apply. They need usually medical supportive help as well as legal help. Most of the approvals that have been done today really likely happened due to political and media pressure. And then the reality is most of our drug policy, not just in Canada, but in many places in the world, still remains a little bit outdated. Despite all our drug laws, drug use continues to increase. And we spend a lot of money on trying to police prison or use the court system, legal system for drug laws. And that's about $6.4 billion a year, which is it's very expensive. What's really interesting about the Section 56 exemption, just to make it even more confusing, is that in Canada, we have a city, Vancouver, who's applied for the entire city to have a Section 56 exemption. So we don't have an answer to this, but this will be interesting to see how the ministry handles it. And so here's just a highlight from the media talking about, despite more and more people potentially being in the queue, some would argue that they're dragging their heels and it's taking too long to approve very ill patients to use psilocybin. So what's been proposed, and the government recognizes this, and so what they're looking at is adding in some of these psychedelic substances into what we call Canada's Special Access Program. And that's a different program where individuals with certain circumstances, health issues, or life-threatening conditions can apply, usually with the help of a physician, to get a unregulated or scheduled drug that is not legal based on some clinical evidence. However, this is supposed to theoretically be a more expedited process. And so I anticipate by either the end of this year or early next year, some of the psychedelic drugs will fall under this special access program. But I think it's too early to judge, given that we don't have the details, whether this will make it more accessible, equally as accessible or less accessible. I think we have to wait. The spirit of it is to potentially streamline applications and to make it a little bit easier, but we'll have to see how that pans out. The government still recognizes and publicly states that clinical trials are really the best way to authorize the sale of restricted drugs for treatments of patients. So they're still strongly recommending that patients who want to use psychedelic drugs do so in research trials. So that brings me to the only legal psychedelic therapy that we have today, and that's ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And that's the combination of the ketamine drug as well as a structured psychotherapeutic program. And the same data that we have from the number of phase 2 trials and 3 trials out there with respects to MDMA or psilocybin, we just use the same model. We do preparatory work, we have experiential dosing sessions with ketamine, and then we do integration work. And essentially when I'm communicating with patients, I really describe this entire field or process as accelerated therapy. It's the drug is a tool that allows us to accelerate a psychotherapeutic process. A little bit about ketamine. It's an anesthetic drug invented many, many years ago. We use it every single day in the emergency room for children who usually have fractured bones as anesthesia, given its safety profile. We discovered over 20 years ago it has antidepressant effects, and it also has been demonstrated to help with pain and migraines. It works on many areas of the brain, serotonin, dopamine, and predominantly glutamate. And there are on-label drug identification numbers for ketamine products such as Spravato, which is S-ketamine, an enantiomer of ketamine. And it's on label here in Canada for treatment-resistant depression as well as suicidal patients with depression. And I put some dollar signs there to recognize that it's extremely expensive. So despite ketamine being a generic drug and being cheap, and when you use it in that format, it can be a little bit more accessible. Spravato is very expensive given its proprietary use. And it works via dissociation, neuroplasticity, and predominantly MDMA antagonism is the predominant mechanism by which ketamine works. So I'm just going to wrap it up with a little bit about field trip health and some of the data that we have with respect to our use of ketamine. And this is unpublished internal data. So we legally use ketamine in treatment-resistant mental health issues, and we predominantly see treatment-resistant depression, but we also see patients with a history of trauma as well as anxiety. The clinics are intentionally designed to foster feelings of curiosity, calm, openness. We do a lot of preparatory work to engage clients. Our behavioral activation and motivational interviewing are the two predominant psychotherapeutic models that we use. And then we use either lozenges or IM, and that's really dependent on the jurisdiction, just due to regulations. The experiences, irrespective of the way that you deliver the molecule, typically last about 60 minutes. Patients usually are in and out of the clinic in about 2 hours. And then we use eye shades and supplemental music. We really, really encourage an inward reflection. This is the program that I've just kind of highlighted in a much prettier fashion. So it's intense. It's a lot of work. It's typically 4 to 6 sessions of ketamine with integration after every 2. And then there's prep work up front as well as a psychiatrist meeting at the beginning. And so patients who do well in this program typically are the ones that are committed and they're ready for dramatic change in their life. This is what the clinics look like. It doesn't look like the typical hospital that I've been used to. So these are obviously intentionally designed. The moment that you walk in one of these spaces, we're trying to intentionally evoke change. We're trying to promote the feeling that you're entering a different space and try to cultivate that feeling as you go into your ketamine journey. These are the individual rooms where we do the dosing. The therapist typically will sit in a chair, hold space, and patients will sit in a zero gravity chair with headphones, music, and a weighted blanket. And that's what it looks like. So last but not least, this is the data that we have. So, excuse me. So you can see here these 3 lines. Blue line is a PCL6 marker for depression, for trauma. The yellow line is a depressive assessment, PHQ-9, and the green line is a GAD-7 anxiety measurement. And so we measure pre, during, and post. And what we're seeing is, rather significant declines in all of these areas of measurements. And when we look at the data about a month later after follow-up, so that's 1 month after their last visit, we see that it's relatively flat. And what'll be really interesting is as time goes on, how does this data pan out 6 months, 12 months later? I believe that using ketamine with psychotherapy is so important to keeping that line flat for a long time. And it'll be interesting to compare it to other ways of using ketamine, such as IV clinics, to see if the data that they generate is different. So to date, I would argue that at least some of our clinics are having quite remarkable success, and we hope that we can continue to bring this to people all around the world. And I anticipate in a number of years we'll have more than just ketamine to offer. So that's it. And I've left my email there if anyone would love to connect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll obviously move on at this stage. And I think if Paul Lewin is available, it will be good to move to Paul. Paul is actually a criminal defense lawyer in Toronto who's been recognized for his litigation and consultation work, particularly in the first instance around cannabis and its legalization. And more recently, he's devoted himself to issues of the constitutionality of the psychedelic prohibition and other aspects related to the accessibility to psychedelic products. So pleasure to have you join us, Paul.
Thank you, Sid. There will be three parts to my talk. One, I'll begin with what the Canadian Psychedelic Association's proposed regulations that were recently submitted to the government. Two, I'll discuss how Section 56 exemptions impact our constitutional rights to psychedelics. And three, I'll say a few words about what I expect is coming in the near future. So starting with the Canadian Psychedelic Association, or the CPA, have created draft regulations called the Memorandum of Regulatory Analysis, or MORA. These have been recently submitted to the government, and there are currently high-level discussions going on with the government about the MORA. I helped draft the MORA, so I like it. The MORA is focused on security, diversion, and safety. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the MORA. I know not everybody is going to love it. We're trying to appeal to the government. If this is going to be the first iteration, if indeed the government agrees to regulate psilocybin in what we believe is a safe and responsible manner. So under the MORA, a healthcare practitioner would authorize psilocybin by signing a medical document for patients under their care. And this is similar to the medical document that's used in cannabis. The psilocybin would only be forwarded to the authorizing healthcare practitioner. So the patient can't walk around with it, the patient can't access it themselves. The healthcare practitioner would approve the clinic where the psilocybin would be consumed. The clinic can be a hospital room. The definition of clinic is flexible as long as certain things are done in accordance with the regulations, but it's a flexible definition. The patient and healthcare practitioner can discuss what would be a suitable clinic, but once a clinic is agreed upon, then the patient would be obliged to consume psilocybin at that clinic. The healthcare practitioner would have the option of forwarding the psilocybin directly to the approved clinic or to a therapeutic regulated professional. The therapeutic regulated professional would include many different types of healthcare professionals. These are all professionals who are accountable to their provincial regulators. The therapeutic regulated professional would be present at all times while the individual was experiencing the effects of psilocybin. This would be the statutory minimum, but there might, of course, be a psychotherapist or other type of professional present for treatment purposes. Finally, the rules would permit therapeutic regulated professionals to have legal experiences with psilocybin in order to be better trained. This would allow therapists and other professionals working in this field to better understand what the individual is experiencing. This is important from both a safety and efficacy standpoint. The professionals would access psilocybin in the same manner as an individual. The professional would be required to obtain a medical document, consume the psilocybin at a healthcare practitioner approved clinic, and be supervised by another therapeutic regulated professional. I will note that the MORA does not permit personal growing. I know there are people who aren't happy about that, and personal growing is important. However, the government is not going to be comfortable with personal growing. The government will consult the police, and the police will raise concerns about diversion, and the government will listen. We want to make this easy for the government. And of course, keep in mind, this is the first iteration. It's our hope that the government will see the wisdom in regulating the underground use of psilocybin so that it can be accessed in a safe and responsible manner. Patients seeking legitimate help shouldn't be branded criminals. Nobody should have to go to the black market to get access. Everyone should be able to do it above board with trained professionals assisting them. This shouldn't have to be done in secret. We're confident the government will see the wisdom of this. I'll move on to my next area, and that's how Section 56's impact our constitutional rights to psychedelics. This might sound a little dry and legal, but I tell you, it's very relevant. And I'm going to just start by noting that Section 7 of the Charter is an amazing tool to bring about progressive change to our drug laws. Section 7 protects the right to liberty and security of the person and not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. That means if you're going to breach liberty and security of the person rights, you have to do it for a good reason, not an arbitrary reason. Liberty protects the right to make fundamental personal choices, and that includes patients directing the course of their own medical care. Security of the person protects Canadians against criminal prohibitions that interfere with a person's choices concerning their physical and psychological integrity. If a breach is established, then one must determine if there's a good reason for the breach. Is it arbitrary? Or put another way, is the patient choice, is the patient making a reasonable choice? Not the right choice, a reasonable choice. The government doesn't have to get drugs into everybody's hands or whatever whim you have, but if they're going to put barriers between seriously ill patients and their medicine, there better be a very good reason for that barrier. And if a patient is suffering, in my view, from treatment-resistant depression or anxiety, then doing nothing is not much of a choice, especially when there's so much promising research. How can we stand by and tell those patients who are suffering so terribly, wait around and soon psilocybin will have a drug identification number? Shouldn't be long, maybe just a couple more years. For that patient facing these awful symptoms, in my view, there is no doubt whatsoever that the psilocybin laws in Canada are breaching Section 7. This is not a tough question, in my view. This is an easy one. However, it should be noted, and this is really where I'm going with this, is that Section 56, if made reasonably available, that means it's prompt and it's transparent and a reasonable ordinary person can access it. Well, if they do those things, it can actually protect their drug laws. And I'll go back a tiny bit. In July 2000, in famous case Parker, the Parker decision, the Ontario Court of Appeal rejected Section 56 as a cover, as protection for unconstitutional laws. And the Ontario Court of Appeal said this. So the government was essentially saying, listen, maybe our laws fail some people and they're unconstitutional in some respects, but you can always apply for a Section 56, so there's nothing to worry about. That makes everything good. And the court said this, Section 56 fails to answer Parker's case because it puts an unfettered discretion in the hands of the minister to determine what is in the best interest of Parker and others like him. Fast forward to 2011 and the Supreme Court of Canada in the Insight decision. So this is the case over safe injection sites. And the Insight group had applied for a renewal of their 56 exemption for their safe injection site. They presented a mountain of evidence and the Harper government refused them. So they brought a judicial review and a constitutional challenge to the drug laws. The Supreme Court of Canada rejected the challenge to the drug laws, but granted the judicial review. Supreme Court of Canada said Section 56 is a great idea and the government should be using this more often. It's in their words, a perfect safety valve. However, there must be real availability and it must be in accordance with the charter. So to paraphrase, essentially the Supreme Court of Canada had a challenge to a government decision and a government law. And they said, well, let's strike down the government decision and say the law is fine. So essentially, if you do what Insight did, which is years of research and planning and intergovernmental cooperation, you get the support of the provincial minister of health, and you have just a mountain of stuff, an expert advisory committee, you go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, well, that's all you need to do to get your 56. Of course, a regular patient who's in serious health, who in all likelihood might be of modest means, given their health issues, and is certainly a vulnerable citizen, should be able to access Section 56 without hiring a team of lawyers and consultants and experts. I'll note as well, before I leave this, that the Crown raised this in a case of mine 2 years ago in an Alberta Queen's Bench case. We had successfully attacked the cannabis laws, and the Crown took the position that Section 56 permanently protects the drug laws. They can never be challenged because everyone can always apply for one of these. They're so easy to get. The judge rejected that. He said that the record was inadequate, that they hadn't granted that many. He also noted that the evidence showed it wasn't clear how anyone would find out about this or how you're supposed to apply. But the takeaway from all of this is that in the future, if they really did start granting these more often, and they weren't so hard to get, and they didn't take so long to get, and there was some more better guidance as to what needs to be submitted, the government could in fact really protect their drug laws. The government is in a way making it easier for lawyers like me by dragging their feet on these 56s. I'll finish off with the regulations in the near future. In the near future, I think one of two things are going to happen. Either the government starts moving to some kind of regulatory model for psilocybin. If that happens, then I think they're going to stick with the Section 56 exemptions as an interim remedy. They're going to be slow. They're flawed in many ways. But they're going to be reluctant to make any other change until they bring in this new regulatory regime. Or in the alternative, as Dr. Verbora said, the government will bring in make psilocybin SAP eligible. If the government does that, then I don't think there's going to be any changes for a while. If psilocybin becomes SAP eligible, then they'll probably make MDMA, LSD, and DMT and other restricted drugs SAP eligible. That does not mean that you can access those drugs. Under the SAP, the government is gatekeeper. This means that although the test is it has to be necessary for a medical condition. It could be necessary for that condition, but the government can choose to reject you for reasons unrelated to your medical necessity. The government can reject you for any old reason. And I'm a firm believer in doctor as gatekeeper, not bureaucrat as gatekeeper. The process is that under the SAP, the doctor applies to the government on behalf of the patient, and access is from a manufacturer, which could include a licensed dealer. A refusal means you have to hire a lawyer and go to court. The SAP, I predict, if they go ahead with this, will be a more streamlined but still dysfunctional version of Section 56. It would be a modest step forward. I think the government wants to move beyond Section 56. It's not really the government style, they're very broad. Dr. Verbora talked about some of the problems. I'll just note one more before I wind down, and that's access. That the exemptions that they're granting are only for personal use. You can't grow it. No one else can give it to you. No one can sell it to you. So there's really no means of accessing it. And this is a horrible flaw that no court will tolerate. I can tell you that the court is going to view it this way, that in effect, the government is conspiring with the black market to secure access. And the courts have rejected that in the past. They've said this happened in the early 2000s in cannabis, in which there was no means of access. They went to court, and this was the Hitzig decision in 2003. The Ontario Court of Appeal was very critical of the government for essentially trying to partner with the black market. So there's got to be access. There has to be a safe, secure source of access. So to conclude, things are going to change. Without regulations, I think a court challenge is likely. And I am hopeful that the government will do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic overview, Paul, of the... Sorry, thank you very much, Paul. That was really a fantastic overview in a short time, and I think you really captured many of the issues that people wanted to know about. And I'm looking forward to the discussion when we move forward. So it's my pleasure now to interview Professor Edward Sellers. Ed is a professor emeritus in psychopharmacology, toxicology, medicine, and psychiatry. And he's also recently been chaired the scientific advisory panel in opiate analgesic abuse for the Therapeutic Products Directorate of Health Canada. And for the purpose of this discussion today, he's also the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for Diamond Therapeutics. So it's a pleasure to have you join us, Ed, at this late stage in the game, but we're delighted to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Sid. So Judy and I are going to tag team. I'm going to review some of the pharmacologic and clinical challenges with some of the approaches being taken with psychedelic research and its application. First, in terms of disclosures, I provide advice to the pharmaceutical and device companies and to regulatory agencies. This does include psychedelics. I get paid for my time. Well, when the government's involved, usually not. But when I work for a company, I don't have any financial interest in their particular product.
Perhaps I could interrupt just briefly, Ed, to say that it's also a pleasure to introduce Judy Blumstock, who's the founder and CEO of Diamond Therapeutics. And so she will be your tag team member.
Okay, thank you. Could I have the next slide? First of all, let's focus on some design problems that we have with conducting high-dose psychedelic studies. First of all, there's a problem with subject and patient selection. Many of the patient subjects have used psychedelics before. Typically, the patient populations are Caucasian ancestry, and many of them have advanced college education. And they nominally have treatment-resistant aspects of various kinds of conditions. So that means they're very familiar with treatment or frustrated with it. Typically, as has been mentioned by others, there's intense preparation for one of these types of sessions. The experience is protracted, 8 or 12 hours. There are guides, there are other trained supervisory staff. There are often follow-up visits, and sometimes there's even repeat dosing. So the problem that arises with this, as has been noted by others, but not these words exactly used, but this creates very high expectancy and has a very high non-pharmacologic component. Another problem with the design is that some of the trials attempt to make double-blind assignment either to placebo or to a low dose, but it's actually impossible to mask the active drug dose of psilocybin because, or any hallucinogen, because the pharmacology is so prominent. So the problem from a scientific point of view is, can you actually conduct a scientifically valid trial with these agents, because you can't mask what people are getting. Next slide. So now let's turn to some practical problems with high-dose psychedelics. As I've noted, the study resource requirements are intense. Intense staff and patient training, a specialized setting, medical backup, has to be strictly supervised for a long period of time. All this means that it's expensive. There's a problem with scalability of many of the kinds of approaches that are being taken, and this bears on the issue of access. You have to have these specialized facilities and staff and backup and so forth. And again, all this adds up to be probably very expensive. From a regulatory point of view, it's not clear that the usual regulatory review can be conducted when it may be virtually impossible to conduct a really scientifically robust trial. Another practical problem is that post-approval, there's going to be a need to control and regulate use. In my opinion, at best case in the United States under the Controlled Substances Act, once there's an approved therapeutic indication, LSD or psilocybin would be in C2. Many people have a misunderstanding. They say things like psychedelics are not addictive, therefore you don't need these controls. But they misunderstand that the international national scheduling controls address not only addictive potential, but also the potential of risk to individuals and society. That's the exact wording from the psychotropic convention. And obviously, hallucinations and alterations in perception are a fairly major risk factor. Another practical problem is that it's very likely there would be pretty extensive post-market approval for any psychedelic. So this will involve guidelines for training, setting, how to prevent diversion, record keeping. There may be a requirement for field studies. So this could be quite expensive. Could I have the next slide? Now, Judy's going to talk about access, and her proposition is that high-dose psychedelic use is going to have limited limitations on access. So this, of course, raises the issue of microdosing. Kim has talked about this, and others have too. Now, obviously, microdosing has no quantitative pharmacologic meaning. It's got a kind of verbal convenience that it's kind of a tenth of full doses, but the problem is we don't really know what the doses are in botanical products or what's bought on the street, and can vary all over the map. And certainly in individuals, we don't know the concentrations of the active hallucinogen after microdosing. And the problem really arises is that we lack sort of comprehensive dose, or more properly concentration response curves in animals and in humans. Only a few doses have been studied, and not very systematically, although it's clear, as we've been presented by some of the presenters in the panels, that there are dose response curves that can be characterized. But this hasn't been done at very low doses very extensively. People like Kim and so forth have certainly made a good start. Next slide. So the notion that I want to communicate here is that high dose pharmacology is very different than low dose pharmacology. And there's lots of precedent for this with many pharmacologic agents. And it's clear that low occupancy, which let's assume just for convenience that this also means different activity, but a different set of subcortical serotonergic receptors and other receptors and other neural networks are activated at these low concentrations and low dosages. So the classical 5-HT2A effects, which are associated with the cortical activity and a lot of the psychedelic properties, these are quite different than very, very low occupancy and different activity. Next slide. So Diamond has tried to address this, and there's the paper that has been published. Guy Higgins was the principal author. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I recommend that you have a look at it if you're interested, because it's good behavioral pharmacology. And what this study showed was that very low doses, for example, 0.025 milligrams per kilo, and 0.05 and 0.1 milligrams, were pharmacologically active. And the interesting part was that this activity improved attention, motivation, and response behaviors in animals that were characterized by being low responders. So in this study, the animals were separated into terciles, and these effects at these low doses and low concentrations that are only 5 to 12 nanograms per ml, the effects were in the low performing animals. And the animal models that were used were meant to sort of simulate the endophenotypes that we see in depression, anhedonia, amotivation, and cognitive dysfunction. So this is interesting because it shows that something different is happening at these kind of low doses and low concentrations. Now, I think that I've turned this over to Judy now to talk about what the implications of being able to do studies with low doses that might be pharmacologically active would be from a point of view of access. Judy?
Thanks, Ed, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the kind invitation to participate and today, and thanks for listening late in the afternoon. As Ed mentioned, I'm Judy. I'm the founder and CEO of Diamond Therapeutics, and as he alluded, our perspective on ensuring access is focused on a long-term goal of developing a prescription low dose of psilocybin, meaning going through Health Canada and the FDA through phase 1 through phase 3, through that development pathway. This is how most patients are currently treated for a variety of reasons, and it's largely related to access. So why is broad access so important? The problem that we're confronting, which is mental health, is broad and deep, and as I'm sure all of you know in the audience, it's not easy to treat. So let's take a look at the factors driving the need for access. About 1 billion people with a mental health or substance abuse disorder worldwide, about 300 million suffering from anxiety, almost as many suffering from depression. I think we've all seen statistics on COVID's impact on mental health, about a 25% increase in depression and anxiety over the past year. These are data that were just published in The Lancet. And we see that 60% of youth with depression do not receive any mental health treatment at all. We know that there's a dearth of psychiatrists in Canada, only 13 per 100,000, 51 psychologists per 100,000. And this is not distributed evenly across the country by any means. So we have issues with rural versus urban distribution of psychiatrists, as you can see here. And there are socioeconomic drivers of disparity. So lower income households experience symptoms of anxiety and depression at twice the rate of higher income households. And issues related to the ability to pay, as we can see with uninsured in the US needing to access mental health treatments and unable to afford it. So all of this really points to the need for a treatment that's amenable to reaching as many as possible, cutting across socioeconomic and other barriers to receiving treatment. But of course, the low-dose approach, the low-dose prescription pathway has its own challenge, including the length of time to get through clinical trials, issues with the legacy of psychedelics in various communities, the design of trials, not easy ever in mood disorders, and so on. So as Ed was saying yesterday when we were getting ready for this talk today, we have a very big problem, just very simply put. I need a solution that can scale to as many as possible worldwide for maximum impact. And so despite the challenges, we're pursuing the prescription pathway to enable broad access. Thank you. Look forward to speaking with you later on.
I'm going to open up the panel. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Ed, for making your point so succinctly. And I wonder if I could start with the question about microdosing. And I'm not sure if Kim is still with us at this stage. It would be expecting quite a bit if she's still there. But my question really is that most of the work has been done with LSD in some of the previous work, and you're now focusing on low-dose microdosing psilocybin. And I wonder, do we need to think about the set and setting issues to the same extent in microdosing in general?
Well, I mean, I can start, Sid. I think the answer to that question is, I mean, apart from the fact that set and setting are important for the treatment of all mental disorders, even though they may not be given as much attention as they should be. But set and setting as it's understood for psychedelics, I think the answer to that is no, because the kind of strategy that Diamond is contemplating is to use dosages that do not produce changes in perception, but have the kind of effects on, say, mood disorders and so forth. So in many ways, they would be, the doses that would be used would be similar. I'll use this just as an analogy with an SSRI, where we should provide supportive and other behavioral therapies and so forth in combination. But the goal here is to be able to do more or less the same for the reasons Judy's outlined, mainly around accessibility. That is the usual pattern of practice.
So I'm just going to fire some of the questions that are in the chat room here, and I'll just one short one for you, Ed. Is there any data on the therapeutic use of alcohol? And I'm not sure if that's alcohol in combination with psychedelics.
I don't know what the question exactly means. Many people use alcohol in a kind of a quasi-therapeutic way and so forth. But I don't think I quite understand the.
No, I'm not sure I get it either. Does tolerance of recreational use impact the therapeutic use of the substance? So I guess if you've been a heavy user recreationally, will you lose any potential benefit?
Well, I don't want to hog the
Michael, what do you
podium
think?
here, but I mean, the answer to this is that we know that serotonergic compounds that act through, say, the 5-HT2 receptor or other systems do show the development of a high degree of tolerance with repeated dosing. And so this is another practical clinical trial problem that bears on duration of treatment. Now, so with some medications like SSRIs, we count on certain kinds of tolerance for certain adverse effects to go away. But whether this kind of phenomenon with psychedelics will occur, my guess is it will, and we'll have to try and figure out whether it's important or not.
Michael, I think this is a question for you, or did you want to chime in on that one first?
Yeah, no, I would agree. And like, as someone who's worked with cannabis for the last 6 years and I've prescribed it to thousands of patients, there's definitely some tolerance there with cannabis. And then if you look at ketamine, well, you know, in our experiences, vast majority of people don't come to us who've previously tried or have a history of abuse with ketamine. It's relatively rare compared to the other drugs. I have come across a couple of anecdotes, and with their experience, you know, they've communicated to me from their recreational use that they need higher and higher doses of ketamine to achieve the same effects.
And one other question for you, Michael, at this point. In your integration of, it says therapy / psychotherapy, but I presume it means drug therapy / psychotherapy that takes place. Can the same usual therapist from outside come in and attend the sessions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we first opened our clinics, the vast majority of our therapists had special training. Well, they all have special training in dealing with patients with altered states of consciousness. It's a very specialized type of training. It's not easy to come by. We've now developed our own internal training programs that, you know, teach others who want to learn more about this. And so other therapists who are external can go through a field trip health training program. And then we have a program we call hoteling, where people can bring in their own patients and they can rent the space. They still have to get psychiatric clearance for the drug, the patient, but then that individual would be able to bring their own therapist with them for their 4 to 6 sessions of ketamine. Okay,
that's actually good to know. Paul, I'd like to see if any of our European colleagues are still with us. So that would include Guy, James, and Kim. If any of you are still on the panel, I wondered if you had any comments in terms of the legal approaches in the Netherlands or in the UK and comparison to what Paul Lewin presented. I think that might answer the question.
Sign of good judgment.
Yes, I think it's been a long haul for some. So the other question really is, from your point of view, Paul, how have you argued, because I think there clearly are differences, but how have you differentiated the legal process with cannabis from the work that you're doing? And you focused particularly on psilocybin, whereas in some centers, and if Emma's still here, I think she would say that MDMA expects to be approved possibly before psilocybin.
Yeah, I think in terms of regulation, the big difference will be, I mean, like right now we're talking about medicinal use, in which you certainly want therapists there, regardless of whether you have a monitor there. But I mean, if we start having religious use or spiritual use under perhaps a freedom of thought exemption, how much do these people have to be supervised, whereas you don't have that issue with cannabis? So I foresee that on the horizon being a big difference between psychedelics and cannabis.
So are there any plans to create continental country province registries databases that could be merged to assist with achieving the necessary statistical power to improve, to get equity in access to scientific studies with psilocybin for individuals across the world. For instance, the province of Manitoba has very little innovative research in treatment-resistant depression, but many patients are interested and willing to participate. So I guess this is sort of regional questions coming from different provinces.
It's Brian. If you can hear me, I can offer
Please
a little
go
bit
ahead,
of
Brian.
insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, only that there's discussions underway how to connect all these burgeoning research centers. So we've got work underway at Queen's. We've got the new center at UHN. There's very preliminary conversation at the University of Manitoba. We know what's going on in BC. So I think the first step towards that would be getting all these centers and the affiliated researchers in conversation, joining some kind of multi-site trial process with industry would be required. So at the present time, there's no concrete plan around a database because we don't have comparable studies underway, but there is discussions how best to build some collaboration across these centers.
But isn't this, Sid, really a general issue and problem around mental health delivery services across the country? I mean,
That true.
you know, the number, I mean, Judy showed a few of the numbers, but
Yeah.
you know, the number of individuals who have a particular index condition who actually access treatment that actually is likely to be particularly useful. I mean, it's far from optimal, I think would be a way to put it.
You're absolutely right. But I think this question was more in terms of data gathering to make the argument for some of the newer compounds. But look, I think that this is probably a good time to wind down. I really have enjoyed, and I think the quality of the presentations and the discussion has been exceptional. For anybody listening, the recorded material for people who registered will remain online, I think, for either 3 or 6 months if people want to listen to the presentations again. We're not sure whether we will be able to produce 6 months. Thank you, Maggie. It's great to have a prompter. So we may be able to produce some summary of the document, which may appear on a website, but we'll see just how much resource we have for that. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining. We've had a team behind the scenes, Wagden and Maggie in particular. We certainly would like you to fill in the survey about what was good, perhaps what was not so good, or what we didn't cover as well as what we did. And you've given us some thoughts for future events. So thank you very much, everybody, for your excellent participation, and to our panelists and chairs. I wish everybody a very good evening, some later than others, and perhaps even some earlier. So have a very good night.